Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Aldersgate Group event today, where we are launching our latest report, Financing the Future. I'm Nick Mollo, the Executive Director of the Aldersgate Group. I'd like to give a very warm welcome, first of all, to the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, John Glenn MP, who will be addressing us in a few minutes, as well as to all our business and NGO panelists, whom I will be introducing in a few minutes as well. And I would also like to thank the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, or CUSP, for having supported our work on green finance for many years now. Now, for those of you who don't know the Aldersgate Group very well, we are all about providing policy solutions that can tackle today's environmental challenges in a way that is effective, but in a way that could also deliver significant economic benefits to the UK economy, such as through increased investment in innovation, the creation of new markets for low-carbon goods and services, growing supply chains, and job creation across the country. And as you'll see from this slide, our business members who come from across the economy have a global turnover of around £550 billion. And we also have leading NGOs, professional institutes, and academic institutions as members. Now, we work across the spectrum of environmental and climate policy, and green finance is a key part of our work. Now, the UK government has made welcome commitments on green finance since the publication of the 2019 Green Finance Strategy, such as by introducing a requirement for all large businesses and investors to produce disclosures by 2025 that are aligned with the recommendations of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFDs. But also by launching the new UK Infrastructure Bank last week, with a clear mission to support the delivery of the UK's net zero target and drive the levelling up agenda, both of which we strongly welcome. However, much progress remains to be made on the green finance agenda. Climate and environmental considerations are still not sufficiently embedded in the UK's financial system. A recent report found, for example, that only around a third of banks or building societies currently regulated by the Prudential Regulation Authority have science-based targets in place or net zero strategies in place. And whilst private investment in low-carbon projects and nature restoration projects are clearly on the rise, overall investment levels still remains insufficient, and there are some areas of the economy, such as heavy industrial decarbonisation project or nature restoration, where important market barriers remain. And of course, the investment challenge will become more pronounced in the years to come, with the Climate Change Committee pointing out in its sixth carbon budget report that some £50 billion of additional annual investment will be required from 2030 onwards to put the UK on track for net zero emissions. So in light of these challenges, the Aldersgate Group publishes a new report today focused on green finance and called Financing the Future. And this report is based on an extensive engagement with FTSE 100 businesses, financial institutions, SMEs, and civil society organisations. Now, in today's report, we make the point that this really is a unique and critical time for the UK to deliver change on the green finance agenda. Now, the government is currently carrying out a review of the regulations governing the financial services sector to reflect the UK's new position outside of the European Union. And following the recent G7 summit and ahead of the COP26 summit this November, the UK is also in a position of clear global leadership on climate change and the environment. Now, this context provides the UK government with the opportunity to, on the one hand, embed environmental and climate sustainability considerations into the rules governing the UK's financial system, but also at the same time to influence similar changes to international rules and standards governing financial markets around the world. Now, today's report makes a wide range of recommendations that are broadly categorized in 5 key areas, and I will briefly touch on some of them now. Now, first, we encourage the government to carry out a review of existing standards, guidance, and definitions governing climate-related disclosures in order to improve consistency and comparability between different disclosure requirements, which we hope will then help accelerate the take-up of disclosure requirements such as the TCFDs. We also call on regulators to provide guidance to improve the voluntary reporting of scenario analysis under the TCFDs, with a view to introducing mandatory scenario analysis requirements by 2025. Now, second, we believe that more focus needs to be devoted to embedding climate and environmental targets into the everyday decision-making of financial institutions. Now, as part of this, we suggest in our report that the government, the Bank of England, and the Financial Conduct Authority should consult on a roadmap which would ultimately require financial institutions to produce net zero targets and transition plans, and we suggest that such regulations should take effect from 2025. Now, as part of this, the consultative process should involve regulators providing guidance to encourage all subsectors of the financial services industry to publish net zero transition plans and targets on a voluntary basis, with this guidance being made available from 2022. Now, we also call for a range of other reforms here, including requiring pension fund managers to automatically enroll new beneficiaries into pension funds that are aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement, and for policymakers and regulators to work together to set capital treatment for banks and insurers that better reflect the long-term risks of assets to the financial system. Now, third, it is essential that we maximize the impact of targeted public finance to crowd in affordable private investment in complex low-carbon and nature restoration projects. Now, as part of this, the recently launched UK Infrastructure Bank should be strengthened by including environmental resilience as a key part of its mandate, ensuring that it is able to tackle different market failures as market conditions evolve, and by increasing its capitalization over time. Now, there should also be a joined-up strategy to ensure that the focus of the UK Infrastructure Bank and that of the government's upcoming green sovereign bond issuances are carefully coordinated to maximize the impact of public finance in overcoming market barriers. Now, fourth, green finance isn't just about the world of finance. It's also about incentivizing project developers, utilities to put forward a pipeline of investable projects in low carbon infrastructure as well as nature restoration. And it's clear from discussions with our members that businesses would welcome the publication ahead of COP26 of a detailed and cross-sectoral net zero delivery strategy that sets out a clear timeline for the policy decisions that will be taken in the 2020s to put the UK on a credible pathway towards its net zero target. Now, this strategy should include greater ambition on carbon pricing, by in particular formally aligning the UK emissions trading scheme with the net zero target. But it should also be carefully joined up with the funding considerations to be covered in the Treasury's upcoming net zero review. And when it comes to nature restoration, private investment could be unlocked by strengthening the target setting and delivery process under the Environment Bill, and this is an issue that the Aldersgate Group is working very closely on with DEFRA, and also by making reporting in line with the new Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, also known as TNFDs, mandatory in the 2020s. Ultimately, this provide an important stepping stone to help businesses put together clear targets and delivery plans to tackle biodiversity loss. Now, finally, the UK should use its leadership position on the climate and environmental agenda to encourage a much greater focus on environmental sustainability in the rules and standards governing international financial markets. This should include collaborating with key international partners, including the EU, on areas of common interest, such as the development of green taxonomies and climate-related and nature-related financial disclosures. It should also include driving progress at COP26 in key priority areas, such as climate finance, as well as finalizing a rulebook for international carbon trading under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So I'm delighted that we have a highly knowledgeable set of speakers today to discuss the issues set out in today's report. Now, I would like to give a warm welcome again to the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, John Glenn MP, as well as to Raphael Vallée, who is the Manager on Sustainable Finance at the Green Investment Group, Sam French, who is the Business Development Manager at Johnson Matthey, Fiona Howard, who is the CEO at Octopus Electric Vehicles, Paul Morling, who is a senior economist at the RSPB, and Simon Christian, who's head of relationship management at Triodos Bank. And I would also like to welcome Tim Jackson, who is the director of the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity. And Tim will be providing us with some closing remarks towards the end of the event. Now, I'd like to thank many of you in the audience who have submitted questions in advance of this for this event. We've received some really excellent questions. We will aim to cover some of them as we go through our different speaker interventions this morning. And there will also be a short Q&A session towards the end of the event. So if you have more questions to ask, please do use the Q&A function and we'll do our best to cover as many questions as we can. But without further ado, I'd now like to hand over to John Glenn for his keynote address. Over to you, Minister.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. Thanks for that introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to participate today. I think everyone on this call understands that collaboration between businesses, academia, civil society, and government is absolutely crucial if we're to make the sort of progress that we want to make on the issue of green finance. And I know that the Aldersgate Group is a shining example of that, convening, encouraging, and at the very least nudging as well. So thank you for everything that you're doing, and congratulations on the launch of today's report. As it rightly notes, ensuring that the right market mechanisms are in place to drive private investment will be vital to support the delivery of both domestic and global climate and environmental goals. It's Mark Carney who's fond of saying that the sustainable transition is, I quote, the investment opportunity of a lifetime. And the government is keen to create a welcoming home for that investment. And we're doing that by putting green financial products on a strong and credible footing across the board, with ambitious and concrete steps to achieve this on the domestic green finance side, guided by two key themes: greening finance and financing green. So by greening finance, we mean changing the plumbing of the financial system so that it takes climate and environmental risk into account, something that we explored in depth in our 2019 Green Finance Strategy. And as today's report recognises, reporting is a key part of that. And our approach so far is focused on two elements. So that's improving the quantity, quality, and credibility of the information out there on how green different firms, products, and services are. And making sure that the measures we implement make sense on an industry-wide basis and avoid the cross-sector fragmentation that can sometimes afflict these sorts of regimes, often well-meaning, but sometimes not completely aligned. Investors need to be clear on what the climate-related financial risks and opportunities are in order to price them and allocate capital confidently accordingly. So for that to happen, we need to get the right frameworks in place that will allow for consistent, comparable, and reliable disclosure. And that's why in a speech to Parliament in November last year, the Chancellor committed to making TCFD-aligned disclosures fully mandatory across the economy by 2025, making the UK the first country in the world to do so. Now, we expect a lot of that to be achieved by 2023, and we set out in the TCFD roadmap last year how we are going to get there. As a department and as a government, we've worked hard to make sure that across financial services and the real economy, our approach is coherent by bringing departments and sectoral regulators together. What has been very noticeable and gratifying is how that approach has attracted a lot of interest from around the world. We're forever speaking to other countries about how to take a coordinated approach. People have seen what we're doing and are keen to find out more. But there's no such thing as perfection on something like this. But I'm confident that what we're doing will help to make the UK a world leader in green finance with world-class risk disclosure. Investor trust in the authenticity of claims about sustainability is also crucial. And investors and citizens are already asking us to look beyond the risks that the environment poses to firms, to the risks that firms pose to the environment. And greenwashing is a serious threat to the transition we need, both in diverting capital to investments that aren't generally on the path to net zero, but also in damaging the faith of investors, large and small, institutional and retail, who want to do well by doing good. So that's why also in his November speech, the Chancellor set out plans for the UK to implement a green taxonomy. And that will ensure a shared understanding of which economic activities count as green for investments. Implementing a green taxonomy is no small undertaking, however. We'll be drawing on the best of international taxonomies, including the principle that in order for an activity to be green, it has to be both good for an environmental objective and not harm any other. It's no good adapting to climate change if you have to degrade biodiversity to do so. But at the same time, we're clear that the taxonomy needs to work in a UK context and make the most of the greater freedom we now have to adapt policies to our own needs. So for that reason, we've launched the Green Technical Advisory Group, GTAG, to provide independent, non-binding advice to the government on developing and implementing a green taxonomy in the UK context. And that includes reviewing the specific scientific metrics and thresholds to ensure that they're right for the UK market. So the GTAG will be co-chaired by the Green Finance Institute alongside the government and made up of financial and business stakeholders, taxonomy and data experts, and subject matter experts drawn from academic, NGOs, the Environment Agency, and the Committee on Climate Change Communities. I'm grateful to the GFI for taking on this hugely important role. So that's the greening finance side of the agenda, which I'm sure you'll agree is key to fostering investors' trust in the transition, but it is only half the story. If the UK is to achieve its world-leading emissions reduction goals, we need to see movements in financial flows, which is why we're also focused on financing green. And my colleagues in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy are hard at work on ways to mobilise private finance for clean and resilient growth. On the Treasury side, the Chancellor has announced the UK's intention to issue its inaugural sovereign green bond, or green gilt, later this year in 2021. And this will be the first in a series of issuances as the UK builds out a green yield curve in the coming years. And the green gilts will help finance projects that are critical to achieving net zero and other environmental objectives, while creating green jobs across the country. So planned green gilt issuance for the financial year 21-22 will total a minimum of £15 billion. That makes this the world's largest debut annual issuance of a sovereign green bond to date. In terms of next steps, the framework will be published next week on the 30th of June, with the debut green gilt to be issued in September, subject to market conditions, and a further issuance to follow later in 2021. And the funds raised will certainly be put to good use. And the government is committed to reporting on the social co-benefits of green spend financed by green gilts, such as job creation and socioeconomic advancement. We're also keen that retail investors don't miss out on the opportunity to take part in this transition to net zero, the nature positive economy. So that's also why the Chancellor announced plans to offer a green retail savings product through NS&I later in 2021, which will be linked to the green gilt framework. So I hope you'll agree that that all adds up to an ambitious and comprehensive domestic agenda. But I fully accept that we can't do this alone. We're under no illusions about the urgent need to get the rest of the world on side too. And the G7 presidency and the COP26 co-presidency has given us a further opportunity to try and do exactly that. And we've made green finance a top priority for both. As part of the 2021 UK G7 presidency, we're delighted to have secured ambitious commitments on sustainability reporting, particularly since it's the first time that the climate and environment have been tabled for substantive discussion in the finance minister's track. The group followed the UK's lead by committing to move toward mandatory disclosures of climate risks for firms and acknowledging the importance of an internationally consistent approach to measuring environmental impact. And this will ensure that markets play their part in the transition to net zero. But G7 finance ministers also welcome work by the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation to develop a baseline global standard for high-quality, granular sustainability reporting, built from the TCFD framework and work of sustainability standard setters. Finally, G7 finance ministers welcome the launch of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD, and the Treasury Commission Dasgupta Review on the economics of biodiversity. I believe that these are huge wins sustainability-wise, but sustainability reporting also makes great economic sense. The Dasgupta Review makes clear that nature provides important services which are too often unpriced and therefore undervalued. It highlights the need to mainstream nature-related considerations into our economic and financial institutions and systems. And we're proud that the G7 finance ministers have made great strides towards this goal. COP26 is also going to be a crucial gathering this year. And in terms of the private finance work for COP26, the objective is simple: to ensure that every professional financial decision takes climate change into account. And that requires a framework which allows the financial sector to allocate capital, to manage risks and seize opportunities in the transition to net zero. And the COP26 private finance agenda, led by Mark Carney, is working to mobilize industry to improve reporting, risk management returns, and mobilization. And the goal is to leverage the private sector to turn billions committed to climate investment through public channels into trillions of total climate investment. And collaboration is also very important here too. The UK is working with the private sector, international financial institutions, with central banks, and with regulators to make progress ahead of COP26 towards the end of this year. And in the spirit of that collaboration, it would be remiss of me not to flag the key asks of the private sector ahead of the November summit, including to join the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ, contribute new finance in developing countries and emerging markets for net zero and adaptation needs, and provide high-quality disclosures in line with the full set of recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So ahead of COP26, we're also calling on firms to phase out coal. We want companies to sign up to the Powering Past Coal Alliance finance principles as a starting point and allow science-based timelines for phase out. It's our hope that leading financial institutions will make coal phase out announcements and encourage others to do the same. We're also encouraging businesses to make ambitious and rigorous commitments on nature positive finance by COP26. And that includes committing to achieve zero deforestation impacts by 2025, committing to become nature positive by 2030, and announcing material new investments in nature-based solutions. I'll stop there. I feel like I've covered quite a lot of ground in a short space of time. But I hope that's testament to how hard the government is pushing on this agenda. Mark Carney's called it the investment opportunity of a lifetime. We could just as easily call it the policy challenge of a lifetime. All of you are integral to the solution. So please keep your policy suggestions coming, because we're listening hard. Thank you very much for your attention, and congratulations to everyone involved at the Aldersgate Group for the launch of today's important report. And thank you very much for the opportunity to join you. I hope you have a fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much, Minister, for an impressive and very comprehensive tour of everything that's happening both on financing green and greening finance. And that's very much how we try to structure our recommendations as well. And I should say that the Aldersgate Group will be part of the Green Taxonomy Advisory Group, so really looking forward to supporting the Treasury's work in this area. I'm conscious that you have to go in a couple of minutes. So if I may, I just had one question that I appreciate your views on. So, and that's more to do with financing green in this instance, which is that the Treasury is working on a very important net zero review, which together with the net zero delivery strategy that BEIS is working on will together provide some important recommendations in terms of the way forward to put the UK economy on track for net zero. What are your hopes for the net zero review? How do you hope it will help sort of solidify the investment context and to put the UK economy on track for net zero?
Well, I can't sort of reveal exactly where we're going with this, but what I think the broadest aspiration that I can sort of convey to you is that we bring a comprehensive set of plans and answers. You mentioned in your opening remarks, Nick, the need to have a sort of aligned and plan that is comprehensive and credible. And I think we recognise that there's so much appetite for clarity over the future direction on net zero. So what I hope is that when we move forward, we'll have something that actually is clear on the costs and on the opportunities, and puts a credible plan and pathway together for investment from government and the private sector that everyone can cohere around and actually move forward with. Obviously, this is an urgent area for us to get right, but it's also very clear that we're true to the real costs and choices that need to be made. The shift in behaviours and attitudes across private and public sector and individual behaviours. And I think it's having that holistic view that's really important. And that's where we're headed and where we're ambitious to land this direction of policy.
Thank you, but that's really helpful. And I think the way you described it around this focus for cost and opportunities would be strongly welcome from by the world of business. Conscious of your time, it's a busy day today with Treasury questions amongst many other things. So thank you so much for joining us, and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
So we'll now move to our business and NGO panel discussion. And for those of you who may have missed some of the introductory remarks, do feel free to submit questions through the Q&A functionality at the bottom of your screen. You'll see it's the middle sort of square box, and we'll do our best to cover some of those. We'll also try and get through some of the excellent questions that were submitted to us in advance of the event. But I'd like to go first of all to Raphael Valle at the Green Investment Group to get a bit of your a sense from you as to what you make of the reports and recommendations and what feels most important to you. So over to you, Raphael.
Thank you, Nick, and congratulations on publishing this great report. I thought it was a fantastic read. I think the report kicks off making the excellent point, and that was echoed by John Glenn, that we need private capital to get to net zero. There's no two ways about that. And in my mind, financing green is a little bit further along than greening the finance system. Thinking about your two chapters, I think the UK has had very strong policies on net zero for the real economy for a long time, and it's in the process of updating them, but we're seeing great strides on building subsidy schemes for new technologies like hydrogen and CCS. We see new regulations come in for the building sector, etc. So this is creating really great certainty in terms of policy for the finance sector. And in my mind, the next really difficult frontier is financial regulation and aligning that with net zero. So I'll focus my remarks on that. And I think my main point on net zero and greening the finance sector is that we're still very much building the plane as we're flying it. So in the last couple of years, we've seen literally dozens of net zero frameworks emerge for corporates as a whole, but also for the finance sector, like SBTI, like PACTA, PCAF, the Net Zero Asset Manager Alliance, Asset Owner Initiative, etc., which is fantastic, but they're all still fairly high level at this point. We don't yet know exactly how all the subsectors of the finance sector will need to put these principles into place, and that includes, to some extent, investment banking, retail banking, but also trading, and the professions that work around finance, like advisors and lawyers. And we need a lot more certainty and a lot more detail to sit under all that. We also need, I think, a lot more long-term certainty, as the majority of these frameworks are still being developed, especially in the detail, and none of them have been quite formally endorsed by regulators just yet. So it's very difficult for us in the private sector to quite know what we should start putting into place now, or whether we should wait essentially to see what might land and stick in the next couple of years. So I think it's making really great steps in the right direction, but we still need quite a lot to happen. And so I would very much support what you said in the report, in your recommendations around the role of regulators. So one point I'd make it on net zero frameworks and where we're at now is that there's both not enough of them and too many of them. So not enough because we're lacking this detail, and we need a lot more of that in the coming months, ideally, and years. But also too many because it's been so far very much led by civil society, which has been fantastic. But we're now seeing dozens of frameworks, and there's uncertainty for the private sector as to which ones to sign up for. Some of them complement each other really well, but others contradict each other to some extent as well. And so I think we've reached a really good point where regulators now need to step in and have very strategic reviews of how all of these frameworks work with each other and what makes the most sense to implement for banks and insurers and others. So it's really about simplifying and unifying what already exists, and recognizing that it's a huge challenge from a skills perspective for both sides. So in the finance sector, we're going to need to recruit completely new skill set to do carbon accounting, but also nature accounting, and to understand how to implement all of these frameworks. TCFD was a challenge skills-wise at the time. I think now we've got the right people in most companies, but now really need to take this to the next level and embed that with broader risk functions and ESG functions in the bank. But it's also a skills challenge in the public sector, and especially with regulators and government, because it's one thing to publish commitments and intentions around aligning the finance sector with net zero. But when I talk to my colleagues internally within the bank and with other banks, the questions we're having now are really technical, and it's difficult for policymakers to start addressing those. But it's questions around trading rules for carbon and exactly what we mean by scope 1, 2, and 3. And the legal professions are coming in, which is fantastic, but the lawyers now have very specific questions. And so we're going to need, I think, the regulators and others to really upskill themselves to really meet the level of detail that is coming from our side, essentially, which is why I very much support one of your recommendations, which is to take an approach similar to that of the TCFD, which is that regulators looked at the TCFD and started to publish soft guidance on that, and did a huge exercise in market testing and getting some feedback from the private sector. And I don't think this is happening enough just yet to really ensure that we know what we're doing and what we're being asked to do is genuinely doable and implementable, and that they're very much testing this with the practitioners so that it can eventually become mandatory for the sector. I think it should be. but I don't think the sector is quite ready for mandatory net zero regulation just yet. I think we need a lot more testing and a lot more learning. The first couple of years, I think, of TCFD was all made on a voluntary basis, which actually created a safe space for banks to publish their TCFD reports, knowing that if they got it wrong, they weren't breaking the law or breaking the trust of regulators, but actually using that as an opportunity to get some feedback and exchange lessons learned. And it's frustrating for civil society, I think. I'm seeing a lot of NGOs pushing for things to become mandatory very quickly and for the sector to adapt very fast, and I understand that. But I think we need a little bit more of a buffer to start learning and upskilling on both sides. So, and I think the report did a really great job of articulating that. So I very much support the points that you've made in the report on that. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you very much, Raphael. That was an excellent sort of intervention. And yes, I mean, I should clarify that when it comes to the net zero targets, we recommend financial institutions, we talk about a voluntary period for 2 or 3 years before such a requirement could become mandatory, and very much see the value in learning by doing, so that when these things do eventually become mandatory, we can do them properly. Very quick question, Raphael. You made a really important point around skilling up, especially on the regulator side of things. Because the more of these voluntary and ultimately mandatory requirements get introduced, then someone's going to have to oversee them properly. Where do you see the areas where regulators most need to upskill? Are there a couple? Is it more about disclosures? Is it around green taxonomies? Is it about helping financial institutions with net zero transition plans? Where's the need?
Yeah, I think it's very much the net zero transition. Disclosure, to some extent, is a lot of the skilling up has been done for TCFD, and I think will be for TNFD. And this is being handled in a bank by ESG teams, etc. So it's in a way slightly less technical. It's making sure we've got the right accounting frameworks, etc. But net zero is about, in some cases, completely shifting investment strategies for a bank. And that can be really difficult. I think in asset management, when we hold an asset for sometimes 20 years or the entire length of the life of an asset, this is relatively easy to do. But in, say, trading, where we might own an asset for 15 minutes before we sell it back on, this is really difficult for us to understand exactly what counts on the books and what doesn't. And so I think regulators will need a much more in-depth understanding of how a trader thinks about net zero, how a lawyer thinks about net zero, how an investment banker does thinks about it, and how public versus private equity might work. And it's suddenly getting into really technical finance skills, right? That is more difficult to come across in the public sector. So I think it will require an even greater level of collaboration with the private sector, where the private sector will need a bit of a safe space with regulators to give really honest feedback on what is difficult to do and what is doable in the next few years before we start ratcheting. But there's lots of appetite for the private sector to do that and to have these conversations with regulators.
Thank you, Raphael, and always good to be reminded of the reality of the world of finance. It's always quite hard to conceptualize that you can hold an asset for 15 minutes before selling it off again. Good reality check. I'd like to move to Simon Christian at Triodos Bank. Now, of course, Triodos has been really pioneering new ways of investing in nature-based solutions and nature restoration projects. It'd be really great to get your perspective, Simon, on what you feel the most important recommendations in today's report, especially in light of some of the things that you're trying to get off the ground.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, clearly this report is music to my ears as an environmentalist working for a bank that's had a holistic approach to people and planet for over 40 years. Triodos was also a founder member of PCAF, the Partnership for Carbon and Accounting Financials, that sets out the framework to assess and disclose greenhouse gas emissions for its loans and investments. And clearly, we believe this is a key to our journey towards net zero and directing future capital investment. This has been obviously supported by regulated bodies, and carbon accounting and net zero really has traction, I think, really, and is really driving forward now. But it's great to see the launch for the task force on nature-related financial disclosures. A task review made a clear economic case for biodiversity, enabling nature to be productive, resilient, and adaptable. We rely on this, and we are a part of nature, and recognise this as a long-term asset class. taking that next step on establishing agreed principles and measuring and disclosing impact on biodiversity will enable the understanding and dialogue and ultimately long-term investment in holistic solutions. We believe establishing PCAF, that PBAF as it is with Partnership on Biodiversity, will not be far behind now. And actually in the UK, the likes of Springfield Meadows, we believe should be an ordinary development in our everyday lives. It's a development in Oxfordshire of 9 affordable and 16 market homes, where it reduced carbon in its construction by 90%, is zero carbon in use, while actually enhancing the biodiversity of the site and nature on the site. And this really should be an automatic, really, for the investment we make today. And so we're looking for immediate guidance on the pathway for financial institutions to shift from this voluntary into a mandatory accounting, disclosure and targeting. And we think that is essential, both across carbon and biodiversity. Really, to support this, we need effective pricing for carbon and biodiversity credits, enabling a clear sight on the value and potential cash flows in the UK, in the same way that feed-in tariffs did for the solar revolution in investment. It was understood and for the many. Ultimately, capital requirements for banks ought to be looking at the risks in carbon and nature. We'd welcome that. And it would encourage investment into the goals that we're all trying to tackle in terms of climate and the biodiversity emergency we face. We do need all areas of government and the financial system to act in the long term if we're going to achieve these goals. But really, we need something to kick off and really push forward investment. And that's what the team, Dan Hurd and his team at the bank, alongside DEFRA, the Environment Agency, and Esme Fairburn, have been working on 4 projects. They're actually mentioned in the report, looking at the likes of peatland and wetland restoration, flood management and nitrate reduction on a landscape scale. Like I said, you'll find this short write-up in the report and more online. It's really to establish a clear message of how important it is for the long term. And then we really think that actually to really enhance this and really drive this forward, we could take something like the social investment tax relief and create an environmental investment tax relief scheme. And this would allow additional funding into projects and those early adopters, but really help establish that clear message and direction for investors. And again, making this a space understood, valued, and clearly invested by the many. And that's really the importance is we should make this a sector that's really understood and driven to the many to invest into, because that's the way we can transition the whole of society on this journey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. You touched on the launch of the TNFDs in the early stages of your remarks. One of the questions we got through the Q&A was, to what extent do you think the TNFD can help redirect finance? Could it, to what extent would it be a game changer for financing nature-based solutions?
Absolutely, it's absolutely essential. I mean, we were part of the, like I said, the launch of PBAF, but you need that regulatory support behind it and framework behind that to really drive that investment stream and really direct the investment. And so we need that framework, that global framework to support, to make sure we're not greenwashing, to make sure we're on that similar sort of playing field. There will be local chapters in the same way there's a local chapter for carbon accounting in the UK. There will be a local chapter for biodiversity accounting in the UK, we hope, eventually, but actually you need that overall framework to really support it and really so that people can really rely on it and therefore value it, and therefore that gives the cash flows that allows the investment to flow.
Thank you very much, Simon. And just as a quick reaction to a really interesting comment that's been made in the chat box regarding the disconnect between some of our recommendations and what's happening with the relaxation of the planning regulations, just to say that, yes, absolutely agree with the comment. And in fact, just last week, the Aldersgate Group sent a letter to the Prime Minister together with the UK Green Building Council making that particular point. And there's actually an article in EFT on that last Monday that you might want to check out. Now, Now, moving from the financial sector perspectives to that of sort of project development, but staying with the theme of nature, I wanted to move to you, Paul, at the RSPB. The RSPB has obviously been pioneering for many years now, quite sort of big, high-scale nature restoration projects in areas such as Wallasey Island, for example. It'd be great to get your perspective on what do you think is needed for the financial system to better understand and incorporate our reliance on nature and invest more towards nature restoration projects?
Thanks, Nick. So the first thing to say is what a great report and what great timing you had following hot on the heels of the Dasgupta government response. I see this as kind of the plan of action to put that ambition into action. So congratulations to Aldersgate Group colleagues and everybody who contributed. In terms of the 40-odd recommendations, I think yes to all, really. I also thought that the report has some really mind-boggling stats in that we need a few billion to save nature that we can't find, and yet there's 22 trillion of assets under management by UK institutions. How do we tap into that? And that ecosystem services deliver 920 billion worth of benefits. That's across 70% of the UK land, but that's 0.01% of the development value, covers 5%. So economics is mind-boggling at times. Also, the 4%, just 4% of the global green bond market is invested in biodiversity, so lots more to do. I thought there were four themes that really ran through the review and already mentioned on. One is about upskilling and learning. One is about the need for long-term thinking and patient capital to replace short-term imperatives. One is about the pace of change. So we've seen lots of momentum in the green finance space in the last couple of years. How do we keep the momentum going? And a clear need for consistency and coherence across all initiatives. You give the example of green investment, the infrastructure bank and the bond, how that'll work together. But in the environment space, there's a pressing need for consistency in environmental policy and delivery. So we have a new panoply of targets and initiatives and 30 by 30 and nature recovery networks, and also a fragmented public funding kind of structure. And I think coherence is essential to achieving additionality from the public funding that we have. And in terms of understanding dependence on nature for finance, I think it's really both in terms of greening finance and financing green, it is the metrics, the standards and definitions. It's that green taxonomy that's key. So nature positive is a great metaphor, but it requires a collective understanding and an operational meaning. And for me, that's in terms of the extent, the quality and functioning of nature, which is not just about carbon sequestration, but that whole array of other services it can provide. And an understanding that systemic risk is very different in ecological terms than in a macroprudential sense, and that solving the ecological crisis is more complex than just dealing with climate change. So carbon, we have a clear metric and it's predominantly a technological issue. With nature, it's much more about management of natural assets for multifunctional benefits. And I really welcome the reference around disclosure being both about the understanding the impact of nature on the loss of value at risk, but also about the impact of business activity on nature, that kind of dual materiality, which I think the minister also alluded to, which is very welcome to think about. Finance in promoting investment in nature. For me, the big challenge is still turning conservation projects that we work on into investable propositions. And so we're talking about the need for finance to upskill and sort of their understanding of nature and climate. There's also a real upskilling needed for us suppliers and experts in delivering nature in terms of finance. So we need finance to help us understand value propositions of our actions, what business models work for ecosystem service delivery, what financial structures and investment structures work or are most appropriate for us. I think we need to work collectively together with finance to design the right regulatory frameworks and market mechanisms that can achieve the hoped for blended financing models that we talk about. And we need to collaborate to ensure that the government provides that right facilitation and support to make private finance flow, because we know we're not going to be receiving huge amounts of public funding directly. I think thirdly, though, we need to learn the lessons from social impact investing and what opportunities exist, not just for the large scale carbon-based MBS and the kind of big restoration, but also the scope for smaller scale community level initiatives, what kind of investment can be driven to that. So I like the idea of the big environment capital bank and investment tax relief there. So mirroring what's happened with the social sector investing. In terms of the recommendations and policies, first and foremost, from a nature perspective, we need mandatory targets with interim targets. We need that roadmap to a nature positive world in exactly the same way as we need that roadmap and structure towards net zero. We still need direct public funding for two particular reasons. One is the systemic requirements to put in place the new policies like the Nature Recovery Network to an effective biodiversity net gain market. There's still a lot of foundational work to put those things in place before the money starts to flow. And secondly, I think we still need more accelerated type funding to de-risk the new sort of nascent but complex asset class that nature sort of represents. I think we need blended finance models that work, where government funding achieves additionality, and a carbon pricing and market framework that still provides the right incentives to follow the mitigation hierarchy. And I think the report's very strong on what's required in that space. And I think in addition to the UK Infrastructure Bank dealing with environmental resilience and understanding how it can overcome market failure, there needs to be a natural capital remit there as well. I think finally, it'd be interesting to see government assess its own spending and investment decisions in the light of environmental impact, something again alluded to in the report. So we often see that in relation to investment-based or project-based stuff around the Green Book and how you implement that more effectively, and at the big scale, like how you sort of complement GDP with other natural capital accounting. But there's also, in terms of budgetary process and spending reviews, what more could the government be doing to look at the environmental impacts of its spending decisions? And maybe we need an Office of Environmental Responsibility to mirror the work of the Office of Budget Responsibility. I also, just as a very final remark, I think we need to understand better the jobs and economic potential for good quality nature to demonstrate how green actually supports the government's ambition to build back better from COVID. And I think there's a tendency, certainly in my sector, to look at the big values delivered by nature in a cost-benefit sense. Sometimes I think we need to think more about the impact in gross value added terms, in terms of jobs and in terms of income generated in the short term. So probably a bit more work for us to do to help the government with its own evidence base there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. You talk about measuring the impact of the government's investments on nature. And obviously, there's a similar theme within the private sector where we're seeing more desire to invest in green, but a fair bit, a sort of a lack of clarity as to exactly how do you measure that? How do you measure the positive environmental impacts that different sort of investments are having? Do you have any sort of suggestions of how we can better measure the role and impact of green finance? It's a question that's come up quite a lot through the questions we were sent ahead of the event.
Yeah, $64 million question. I think what you fundamentally need is that target setting framework that cascades down from the global level to the national to the organizational level. So you need consistency about what it is we're trying to achieve in parallel to what we do with net zero. And I think in terms of extent and quality of nature, we're there, we can do a lot in that space. So we understand exactly how to measure certain outcomes. The biggest challenge of all is in terms of the functioning of nature, because there you're dealing with very different types of systemic risk. And it's very hard to understand an organizational impact in terms of its cumulative impact on what that risk looks like. So we have the rivet kind of analogy with biodiversity loss, which is you can pull a few rivets out of a plane and you don't notice the difference. By the time you get to 100, the plane starts to rattle. By the time you get to 250, you pull it out and then the plane just ceases to fly. And that's kind of how biodiversity loss sort of works. It's death by 1,000 cuts. If there's one tool I think that's the most prospective for organizational level management and which can also be replicated in the finance sector, it's natural capital accounting, because there you're taking baseline measures that we would have from the national level to say what it is we're trying to achieve, and you're developing that within the organizational context. So tools are there, I think, for some of it. I think there's more work to do, particularly in terms of the way nature functions.
Thank you very much, Paul. Really comprehensive. So I'm now, we're going to stay with the topic of project pipeline, but focusing more now on decarbonisation. I'll move to Sam French at Johnson Matthey. Sam, Johnson Matthey is really leading the way when it comes to the decarbonisation of heavy industry, and your business is obviously focusing a lot on the development and production of low carbon hydrogen. What do you feel are the most sort of important recommendations, I guess, that we make in today's report to support innovation in hydrogen and CCS and other technologies to cut emissions in heavy industry? And within that, I'd really welcome any thoughts you have around the role of carbon pricing in driving investment and innovation in this space. Again, that's a question that's come up quite a lot in the Q&A process. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Yeah, and it's great to be here, and I'm going to put my hands up. I'm not a finance expert. This is the area I'm looking in is how you can develop a market and how finance tools can support that. So absolutely, the piece that resonated with me was certainly your comments around the how we can accelerate private investment, and one of the key things underlying that will be carbon price. But I think some of the comments you make around the need for really good signals and signposts, the comments around the shadow pricing, predictability is one thing that starts to unlock investment. So we know that the private sector's there wanting to invest in new areas and new technologies. Within the UK, we do have the opportunity to take a leadership position in some of these new industries. You specifically mentioned low carbon hydrogen, which is an area I work very closely, which is the majority of my life, to be honest. So we're at a tipping point, though. I think there's a lot of really good work's been done, and I think there is some very opportunity for that leadership position is now. But I suppose the question is, why do we want to be a leader, and what does that bring with it? Critical, I think, for us is that it grows the supply chain. It grows not only the opportunity to deploy projects within the UK with the highest available UK content, but it also positions UK companies to export. And what does that do? That creates opportunities. And the interesting thing with some of these new technology areas, such as low carbon hydrogen or carbon capture and storage, is that they're going to develop opportunities for people in places within the UK that have in recent times lacked investment, lacked support, lacked funding. Equally, could lead to investment in areas in the UK which have seen the good times, but the good times are not there now. So areas where the jobs are supported by the oil and gas industry, and we can transition those people from the fossil fuel based industries into low carbon renewable type jobs, which will be hugely important for this to be a fair and a just transition. So that's something, particularly financial tools, that we shouldn't forget about. This isn't just about hitting net zero, it's about doing it in a way that's equitable and just across society. I equally just want to quickly pick up on the point around this being the investment opportunity of a lifetime. That has two connotations for me. It is the very positive piece. Absolutely, there's an opportunity for people to invest, do the right thing, and potentially make a lot of money. Equally, the flip side of that is that we're at a point where some of the investments we're starting to think about today might take 5 years to get to operation via engineering, financial investment, decision, construction, and they could operate for 20 or 25 years. So all of a sudden, we're talking about projects that are going down on the ground today that will be operational in 2050 when we need to hit net zero. So the other piece here is about the investment opportunity of a lifetime. This is the critical time. These 5 years that we've got leading up to 2030, I think, is the window that we really need to be making sure projects that go down on the ground are fit for purpose in 2050 in a net zero world. So really, what does it come down to? It comes down to how we release that private investment and what are the barriers to do it. I think ambition, you have to have clear signals in ambition. We've seen some of that from the government 10-point plan. We're hoping to see more with the hydrogen strategy coming up. Then for private investment, you've got to minimize risk. essentially within risk, you've got technology and markets, in a very crude summary. What's the business, what's the market risk, and how do you mitigate that? What we need there is clear business models that are going to stimulate the initial projects, provide a subsidy until essentially the stick, which is carbon price, comes to the point that it means that these low carbon, zero carbon technologies are actually cost competitive against their fossil alternatives. And then really, how do you reduce risk in technology? That's by deployment. And as you've mentioned already, by learning by doing. And so those are, I think, the critical things. Very last point, let's not be naive. This isn't us doing it on our own. There are a lot of countries out there who would like to grow their supply chain and export all of their products into the UK. So we could be very good at deploying these technologies, but that won't bring the biggest advantage back to UK PLC. It's about not only deploying, but it's also about growing the supply chain. Thank you.
That's a really important point. Thank you, Sam. And I think it reminds me as well of, one of our key expectations for the UK Infrastructure Bank is that it can help not only draw crowd in private finance in complex low carbon and nature restoration projects, but actually seek to deliver broader industrial benefits as part of that, including supply chain growth. And we saw some really good examples of that being done with the Green Investment Bank in the earlier days of the offshore wind industry in the UK. Now, last but certainly not least, I'd like to move to Fiona Howarth at Octopus Electric Vehicles. Now, Fiona, surface transport has become a priority area together with buildings in terms of cutting emissions to put us on track for net zero. We're looking at some drastic emission cuts needing to be made under the 6 carbon budgets for surface transport between now and 2035. We, of course, have the target to end the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles by 2030. Can you give us a sense of what are the key financing barriers and how we tackle them?
Yeah, thanks very much, Nick. Delighted to be here, and congratulations on the launch of your report. Fantastic read. I'd be delighted to talk about the EV sector a bit and how we make that transition to net zero in the transport sector. For a start, I'd like to welcome the kind of encouragement in the report to encourage the finance sector to embrace innovation, to move quite quickly, which we really need to do now in this space, and also for that UK leadership role in terms of taking the stage really with COP26. So let's have a look. For those that don't know Octopus Electric Vehicles, our mission is to make it really simple and easy for people to make that switch to electric transport. So that covers the car, the charging and the energy. And we are part of the Octopus Energy Group, which is really leading in that smart energy system transition. As you think about the net zero challenge in transportation, transport now contributes 30% of our carbon emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions here in the UK. And if you look at the power sector, for example, that's actually reduced their emissions by 65% since 1990 levels. But in transport, we've only reduced it by 5% since 1990 levels. So it's really negligible compared to the really big strides we've made in other bits of our economy. One of the key challenges there is there hasn't been good vehicles, right? So all of us particularly want to be able to get from A to B, to go and be able to see our granny or to see our friends and family, but there hasn't been a good alternative, clean alternative, unless you could cycle or walk there. So now we have fantastic electric vehicles, and actually we really need to embrace that change and really push on making that change as quickly as we can to have clean and green transport. So what's holding us back? We asked a lot of people what was holding them back, and the top 3 things they said was 49% of them said cost, so their perceived cost, 35% of them said the number of charge points, and about 30% of them said the range of those vehicles, so how far those vehicles would go on a single charge. I'm going to talk first about the cost and the range, and then I'm going to take the number of charge points and the energy system, and then finally come back to the UK position in terms of that leadership. So let's take cost and range as the first one. So first of all, actually, like for like, buying them, they are slightly more expensive at the minute. However, at a total cost of ownership level, because of low running costs in terms of electricity being a lot cheaper than petrol and diesel, and actually in terms of low servicing and maintenance costs, they are cheaper, but there's a perception challenge there. And actually the people that are selling EVs don't particularly want to sell them that much at the moment because there aren't that many of them available. So we have a supply issue in terms of those vehicles. So what we need to do is we really need to back those car manufacturers in being able to make that switch to actually making those cars, making them at volume, both not just for the UK, but globally. And so actually, how do we get behind them with the supply chain and that manufacturing expertise and scale as quickly as possible? So there's a real financing challenge in terms of embracing that with those car manufacturers to help them invest and make that switch as possible, as quickly as possible. And I really welcome the investment that the UK government are making into the kind of large scale battery manufacturing, for example, that they committed to, the 500 million they committed to last year. So that's absolutely fantastic leadership in that space. But there's a lot more that we can do in terms of getting behind those car manufacturers and leading that conversation this year at COP. So that's that. And that's also tackling the range problem as well. Because the more that we get behind that battery manufacturing, for example, we've already seen the cost of batteries come down, well over 85% in 5 years. That's going to continue to decrease, continue to bring the cost down. Secondly, on the cost side, there's actually a lot of kind of innovative products around that help make it more accessible for people. So for example, subscription products are picking up, or we do salary sacrifice where you can pay for it out of your gross salary. And actually more banks getting behind us and taking that leap with us and unlocking lower cost of capital for those financing products will really help us accelerate in that space as well. So therefore people can try before they buy with the EVs. And what we find is once you try, you don't want to go back. They're really fun to drive. If you haven't driven one yet, you should do. And so I definitely recommend kind of the financing sector getting behind alternative financing products, particularly in insurance, for example. We're really looking for competitive insurance products for salary sacrifice, which is really challenging. So we need competitive, innovative thinking across that finance sector. So let's tackle some of the cost and range part. Let's look at the charge points. Charge points is really a perception thing at the minute. So there are over 15,000 places you could publicly charge your car today, compared to 8,500 petrol stations. So almost double the number of places you can publicly charge your car. And in addition, most of our EV drivers are charging at home or potentially at work when they go back to their workplaces. So that's actually phenomenal. For all of the EVs that we've got on the road, there's about 20 EVs for every public location you can charge your car. And actually what we've seen in Norway is they've had a big increase in electric vehicle sales. Over 50% of their new EV car sales actually EV, with a weaker charge point infrastructure than we have here. What we really need to do is get the commitment again behind those cars coming to the UK and backing that, because what we actually need to see in that charging space is the people that are making the investments need confidence that there's going to be cars. So we need the cars so that they have confidence of utilization, because at the minute those charge points, there's too many of them versus there are cars. We need confidence the cars are coming. Then we'll get more charge points and we'll get them in the right places, because there'll be commercially led decisions around where people are going to use those charge points. So we put a lot of financing in, actually led by kind of, a central decision-making function that might not be led by consumer demand and where we actually really need the charge points. So actually my message here is, let's get more cars, let's get commitment behind those cars and the grants and the financing there. Then we can get the charge points and continue to increase that in the right places. Third thing is around the smart energy system. So also, obviously we need energy to be able to power those, green energy, renewable energy to be able to power those cars. And so we need to really invest in that infrastructure, both in terms of the generation and also the grid. And my most important message here is like making sure that grid is smart. So as we get more renewables are intermittent, the wind might blow when it blows, the sun shines obviously in the middle of the day. Actually, how do we store that in a great way so that we can use it at the right times? EVs, batteries on your driveway, we can now use them to store them at the right time. We can charge those up in the middle of the night. So we need to be doing that at the right time. When the wind is blowing, we need pricing signals that reflects that. We need to be able to have smart charging, which we do today. We have tariffs that enable that. We have smart charging that enables that, so that we can balance the grid between the renewable energy generation and the consumption. And actually the Ofgem report a couple of years ago estimated that would save the UK 40 billion if we did the smart energy system in the right way. And again, we are leading in that as the UK. And actually we can take the technology that we have developed here in the UK and help other economies do that and encourage a smart energy system. So from a UK international impact, I think there's two things. One is, let's take that smart energy system that we are demonstrating here in the UK today and let's demonstrate that and show our expertise and take that globally. And then secondly, to the point earlier, let's really think about how we can influence the car manufacturers and get behind them and bring financing into the actual building and making of these cars and that supply chain. So a number of thoughts for you there on the transport side.
That's very comprehensive, Fiona, and I think the way you brought together what we need to do on the energy side and the transport side, goes back to our key ask about having a very integrated cross-sectoral net zero delivery strategy as well, which we really hope will be forthcoming in the autumn from BEIS. Just a very quick follow-up question. You talk about the fact that manufacturers have not been all that enthusiastic about selling zero-emission vehicles, if probably a slight understatement. I know that one of the policies that's been considered in China, for example, was the introduction of mandatory sales targets for zero emission vehicles. Do you think we should consider something like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen that work with success actually in California, for example. So they've had a zero emission vehicle mandate there, whereas 30% of their vehicles had to be EVs. And we did see an increase there in terms of the number of vehicles that came to market. And certainly that is a good interim step. I think there are bigger conversations that probably need to happen around the supply chain as well and really unlocking that at a global scale. But certainly on a UK level, I think that would help.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for some great contributions. So I've been able to cover quite a few questions we've received throughout your contributions, but I'd like to have a sort of a final sort of Q&A round with all of you before we move to Tim Jackson's closing remarks. So I'm going to ask you all we've received two very connected questions. I'm going to set them out now, and I'm going to give you each 1 minute to give your thoughts on those questions. So the questions we received were which current or upcoming aspect of UK environmental regulation or climate regulation do you think makes the UK the most attractive place to invest or the least attractive place to invest? So what part of the regulatory system that we have in place makes the UK a good or bad place to invest when it comes to nature restoration and low carbon infrastructure? And connected to this, the second question that we got was, if you had a magic wand and you could only introduce one policy, what policy would you introduce to drive investment in net zero and nature recovery? So I'll let you play around with how you want to answer that. I'll give you 1 minute each. I will start in reverse order, if that's okay. And sorry for putting you on the spot again, Fiona, but I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think the UK has done a huge amount to encourage innovation into the energy system, the smart energy system that I was saying earlier. So we're leading, for example, a large-scale vehicle-to-grid project, and that has enabled us across the UK to be very innovative there. And I think that does encourage investment into this space, both, and that's just one example of many things the UK have done to encourage investment into the green energy space. So I think that's very exciting. I think in terms of the policy, Nick, I really liked your suggestion around the zero emission vehicle mandate. So I think I really welcome the 2030 ban announcement that was made last year, but I think some of those interim steps could be clearer and some encouragement to do that sooner rather than later. I think that's helpful. I think we should really look at the grant extension as well. I know that we're reducing the EV grants at the moment, but I think encouraging those and encouraging that uptake, we know that's one of the key blockers, is also really important to keep that and maintain it and look after it.
Thank you, Phil. Well, we'll make sure we send a letter to DFT this afternoon. Sam, over to you.
Cool. Nice, easy questions. Again, I think UK has done some good things in terms of putting elements into legislation much earlier than other governments. So the Carbon Budget 6 is a very challenging set of targets, but it's what underlies that, and really, are we on a pathway to succeed? We mentioned earlier ambition around hydrogen. I think we've got to get that into legislation and move it away from being an ambition. That should be a technology agnostic, low carbon hydrogen policy. And clearly, hydrogen's only one part of our transition to a low carbon future. We still need all of the investment in renewables. So I think the one piece, if I had the magic wand, would be around having a predictable carbon price plotted out that government will stick to from now to 2050. Now that would cause all sorts of trouble with markets and finance and how you trade it and what happens with things going up and down, but it would give certainty and would give a route to really nailing down investment. Anyway, there's probably a lot of flaws in that idea, but we'll start there.
Thanks very much, Simon. That idea is very much included in a report, and we'll see how our two finance speakers respond to that challenge in a minute. I'll go to Paul now.
So in terms of regulation, upcoming regulation that's going to make us a great place to invest, I think we should start by recognizing that in a recent index of nature loss, we're the 12th closest to the bottom of the nature intactness index. So in terms of how nature denuded we are, we're terrible. We do have initiatives in place to create markets of biodiversity. So we do have the opportunity to drive areas where you're going to have a price attached. So biodiversity net gain provides a huge opportunity. I think in terms of what we have with habitats, we have huge opportunity for carbon gain. So we've looked across the piece in terms of both blue carbon, in terms of peatland, in terms of the potential for forest restoration. We have huge ambition. We have the supply side there. We can make the money flow. In terms of policies, I think getting the task force nature-based disclosures right, solving those questions around green taxonomy is going to be absolutely crucial. So whatever gets put in place there is going to be, for me, one of the most important transformational bits of policy.
Thank you very much, Paul. That's really helpful points, and also a very good reality check in terms of where we really are when it comes to the nature-based investment. I'll move to you, Simon, now.
It's all the good ones have been taken. So yeah, so in terms of we're quite good at getting regulation into place. Not always great on the delivery. To be fair, I think would be the case. Yeah, I want carbon credits to be and the money to be sorted out. I want nature-based credits and the money to be sorted out. So but they've already been said. So I'm going to take something completely different. Why on earth is the government subsidising social housing and affordable housing, building public assets with our money that aren't already net zero? Why are we still doing that today? What's going on? They're not exactly leading the way.
No, very good point. And that's one aspect we've covered a bit less today, but the urgency of decarbonising the built environment, and the fact that at the very least we should make sure that all new developments are either net zero or at the very least net zero compatible. So really good point, Simon. Thank you. Raphael.
Yeah, difficult questions. I agree with everybody on the legal frameworks. I think on infrastructure, they're very much there. They're being updated as they need to be, but there's a lot of trust from the sector that policy frameworks are there to stay and they're long-term and relatively stable. Though I'd completely agree with Paul that we're just not doing well enough on nature. And it's not a space that we've learned about enough in the finance sector. So it would be great to see the same level of policy certainty and clarity on nature. In terms of a magic wand, I might suggest actually a couple of things. The first one, none of them are realistic. The first one would be to have very clear sector-specific glide paths to net zero. So I think there's a tendency still for investors to hold back from things because we're not quite sure yet if we're going to go more hydrogen or more electrification or more something else. And I think we need to start really making these difficult decisions so that we have a bit more certainty over how many gigawatts do we actually want to be building in green energy versus hydrogen, et cetera, and just have a clearer pathway to 2050 would be one. And the other, maybe a little bit more realistic with the launch of the new infrastructure bank, is for the public sector to be a lot bolder in how they spend money. I think there's a tendency to stick to very well-treaded paths in terms of financing models with grants and subsidies, etc. And there's so much appetite from the finance sector to be quite bold and innovative with new structures in blended finance, etc. And I think the public sector needs to trust the private sector a little bit more to do that and to take public money and to do some really smart, creative, innovative things with it that gets us to getting new technologies to be much more commercial than they are today, but that might need slightly different structures than just the traditional subsidy mechanisms that we've had so far.
Thanks very much, Raphael. And on the both very good points. And on the point on roadmaps, it's worth pointing out that one of our recent reports actually used the precedent of what's been happening in Sweden, where the Swedish government and Swedish industry have developed a range of sector-specific fossil-free roadmaps. Really worth looking at that because it sort of does what Raphael was alluding to. Well, thank you to all of you for dealing with those questions so efficiently on the spot. I'd now like to move over to Tim Jackson, the director for the Centre Center of the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, who have very kindly supported our green finance work for a number of years now. Tim, we've got a good 5-7 minutes for some closing thoughts from you. I know you've got a very keen and detailed interest on the issue of green finance, and then I will give you just enough time to wrap up the event. So over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Nick. And thank you all very much for what was an absolutely fascinating session. And to my mind, Sam, I think it was, picking up on the minister's comment, is absolutely right that this is an opportunity of a lifetime, not least because of what's at stake. I want to come back to that point about the opportunity of a lifetime, because I think that there are different ways of seeing what that means, and some of them are profoundly wrong. And it's a danger that I want to kind of highlight. But it would be absolutely remiss of me not to start by thanking the Aldersgate Group, in particular the authors of this report, so Josie Murdoch, Anna Musat and Nick Mulho, for a terrific report, a very timely report, an essential report given that opportunity and that challenge that we now face. And also to thank Nick for his leadership in Aldersgate Group over the last few years, where we have been actually very, very grateful to be able to finance his work on green finance through the Aldersgate Group from the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity. I mean, from our point of view, any question about future prosperity inherently involves us facing questions of investment, because investment essentially is our fundamental commitment as a society towards the future, towards future prosperity. It's why we set aside some of our income and don't spend it all at once, because we have essentially a prudential nature as a species, and we think and we care about our children and their children, and that involves setting aside money now in order to invest in the future. That ultimately is the social license of the finance sector. It doesn't really go beyond that. There is no social license in the finance sector, for example, that exonerates any particular class of asset-rich holders of lucrative assets from using that position to lobby governments to ensure that the conditions are right for them to make a killing into the future. And that's the danger that I was alluding to in relation to greening finance and the financing of green. And the minister talked about a billions pot of public money, hoping to leverage trillions of private money. And it absolutely matters where that money goes, where that money is leveraged, how that is set up, how the mechanisms are set up, and how inclusive that investment program is, how inclusive our financial sector is. And it was a point that several of you mentioned, and is an incredibly important point when it comes to the legitimacy of greening finance or financing green. At a certain point in time, and this of course is a vision for the future, greening finance and financing green become the same thing. They become a financial system that actually is investing in the things that matter, that is laying down the foundations for ecological integrity, that's investing in our care economy, that's investing in the technologies that we need to become more creative and more innovative. And all of those things converge if the regulatory systems are right. And again, many people made this point. There's a clear need for clarity over the regulatory system as this transformation takes place. But I think we should be in no doubt here that what we're looking at, although it seems like a kind of niche market in the midst of a financial giant that is complex and sometimes very, very far from inclusive, we are looking at the possibilities of a transition to a financial system which is fair, sustainable, and better for all of us in the long run. And that's what's at stake. And that's why it's worth writing these reports. It's why it's worth fighting, indeed, all of the battles that we have to fight in the financial sector, in the EV sector, in the policy sector, in the NGO sector. These are incredibly important battles, and they'll become more important, not just for COP, and we're very fixated on COP at the moment, but actually in the aftermath of that. I wanted to point, if I may, to a kind of, why that wide territory that I've sketched there, that huge vision that is available to us to fight for, is such a difficult one at this point in time. And I think it was exemplified by the very different kinds of investments that you have spoken about this morning, that the report speaks about, and the conditions and the conditionalities of those investments. So if I could start maybe, with Fiona and EVs, fantastic sector. It's got enormous potential. It has government backing. It is the frontier of technology. It's very, very sexy. It shouldn't exactly be rocket science, except maybe in Tesla's case, to figure out how to get an EV sector working, particularly if you've got a government that's prepared to leverage some of its public funding into that private sector. And it will give returns. You know, that's in fact why car manufacturers are almost falling over themselves to become a part of that EV sector at the moment. They can see where the writing is on the wall. They can see the direction of travel. They can begin to invest those funds. They can see public funding coming in behind that. And it will, at the end of the day, I think it will, you know, as both Fiona and Sam have talked about, it will give that element of predictability that will allow that sector to thrive and to flourish and to give good returns. But it will be a very, very traditional financial sector. It will be a tech sector with potentially enormous returns, with relatively few asset holders, that will not necessarily in itself, as it develops, benefit the majority of society, nor necessarily in itself trickle down into the kinds of investment that are completely the other end of the spectrum we need for small farmers in very, very local vicinities to be able to invest small amounts of money at minimal, zero or even negative rates of return to protect the habitats that will prevent biodiversity loss. And that's what we're looking at. That's what green investment at the moment is looking at. It's looking at you know, we talk about it often in fairly undifferentiated ways, but this is a huge spectrum of investments across different kinds of technologies, different kinds of institutions, different kinds of sectors with very, very different kinds of finance structures, very different kinds of rates of return and scales of return and time scales of return. And so the points that were made, for instance, by Simon and Paul, I felt, you know, incredibly important ones around investing for the many and the patience of capital. This is not the time to take Mark Carney's injunction that this is an opportunity of a lifetime as a license for as many people with assets already to direct those assets with government backing into sexy, high-tech, high-return sectors and run away with the benefits of that public money. This is a time at which we need to be absolutely wary of that danger, as we weren't quite wary of it in the feed-in tariff. And so much of the feed-in tariff initiative, the policy initiative there, was actually structured around people who already had money, who were looking for 8% rates of return, which were above market rates of return at the time, and in which communities actually were a minority of those investments in solar energy at community level, but would have been satisfied actually with very low rates of return, would have returned those benefits to the community level. They would have had wider environmental impact, and it would have had wider social impact as well if the feed-in tariff had mainly been structured around those small-scale, diverse, community-led investments that actually were not profiteering off the back of the public leveraging of private investment. So that is the danger. That's the very real danger that we face as we go into this very differentiated sector. Green investment is not one sector, it's several sectors, but there may be a value actually in thinking of it as one initiative to create a financial sector which returns to the financial sector the social license to operate that we need it to have, for example, to provide people's pensions over the long-term savings investments for those lumpy purchases that we need, and borrowing facilities to buy our houses. Those are social functions. They deserve support, but they live in a very complex architecture in which, without proper oversight, there is a lot of opportunity for what we could only call gaming by those who already have access to assets and do not address that question of those who are left behind, as Simon was pointing out, and the investment needs of local communities, and in particular of the poorest in society, some of whom are trying to protect nature on the land as we speak. So that's the challenge. I mean, it seems to me, and I'm always a little bit wary about putting grand ideas into meetings like this at the last minute, but actually having occasionally done that once around nature-based task force for nature-based financial disclosures, and once around the idea of green sovereign bonds, I'm no longer worried about it. I think that, you know, the wacky ideas of today become the central ideas of tomorrow. And my wacky idea for today is actually that if we're thinking about green finance in a systemic way, we have to think of the mechanisms through which those high returns in the sexy EV sector and the technology development can actually be funneled and channeled into the places which will allow us to give and return value to the land, to nature, to biodiversity, where its own natural cycles insist that you can't get above market rates of return. You can often get something around zero if you're very, very lucky. And so those mechanisms that actually transfer value from that high return sector to the low return sector will become the kinds of mechanisms that decide whether green finance and the financing of green is an opportunity for the many, or is about the unwieldy claiming of further opportunities for the already rich. And I'm pretty sure it's not in anybody's vision on this call, and it's certainly not in CUSP's vision to argue for anything like the latter. What we're looking for essentially is a green finance system that supports the idea that investment is an activity that supports prosperity for everyone and is a real commitment to the future.
Thank you very much, Tim, for those really great thought-provoking concluding remarks. Our session has come to an end. I'd like to thank all of our panel speakers and Minister Glenn, who addressed us at the start of the session. Really appreciate your time. It's a busy time for everyone, so thank you. And many of you have inputted in the report as well, so that was hugely appreciated. Thank you to all those of you who attended today's event. We've received lots of really good questions, so really appreciate that. And a massive thank you to my colleagues Josie Murdoch and Anna Musat for the huge amount of work they put into this report. The amount of stakeholder engagement that went into it and research was enormous, as was the report preparation process. So their work is massively appreciated. So thank you all. You'll see the link to our report on the chat box. If you're not yet a member of the Aldersgate Group but would be interested in joining, do also get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. So that will be it for us today. Thank you very much for joining us and have a good day. Bye-bye.